Delia Okonkwo-Price had spent every summer of her childhood at the pale blue Victorian on Winslow Street, a house her grandmother Aggie had bought in 1974 with money saved from 3 decades of work as a seamstress, back when the neighborhood was rougher and the house considerably cheaper than the comfortable, tree-lined street it had become by the time Delia was old enough to appreciate it. Aggie had raised 4 children in that house largely alone after her husband left when Delia's mother, Renata, was still in elementary school and had filled the rooms, over the following decades, with the specific, accumulated warmth of a life built through sheer persistence. Hand-sewn quilts on every bed, a kitchen that always smelled like something simmering, a back garden where Aggie grew tomatoes and okra, and a stubborn, thriving fig tree that produced more fruit each August than the family could ever manage to eat. Delia's own parents had divorced when she was 7, and the summers at Aggie's house had become, in the years that followed, something closer to a refuge than a simple family visit, 6 or 8 weeks each year where Delia escaped the tension of her mother's cramped apartment and her father's increasingly infrequent phone calls, settling instead into the steady, predictable rhythm of her grandmother's world. Aggie taught her to can tomatoes on the back porch during the hottest weeks of July, taught her to read tarot cards from a worn deck she kept wrapped in silk in her bedside table, taught her, most importantly, a particular kind of quiet confidence that Delia hadn't found reflected anywhere else in her family. Aggie's habit of listening carefully to what Delia actually wanted rather than what a 9-year-old girl was supposed to want, of taking her opinions seriously in a way that felt, at the time, unremarkable, and only later, as an adult, revealed itself as something genuinely rare. The rest of the family had always occupied Delia's life with more complicated, distant energy. Her mother Renata, the second-born of Aggie's 4 children, had never quite recovered from her own father's abandonment, carrying a low, persistent anxiety about scarcity and abandonment that shaped most of her relationships, including her relationship with her only daughter, whom she seemed to alternately cling to and resent depending on the week. Delia's uncle Desmond, the oldest of Aggie's children, had spent most of his adult life positioning himself as the family's de facto authority, a role nobody had formally granted him but that he'd assumed anyway through sheer persistent assertion, making major family decisions with a confidence that discouraged pushback even when his judgment proved questionable. Her Aunt Carol, the youngest, lived 2 hours from Aggie's house and had, in recent years, become the family member most physically present for their mother's day-to-day needs, a role that had earned her a certain moral authority within family discussions that Delia, living 4 states away, had no comparable claim to. Delia had moved to Ohio at 26, a decade before Aggie's death, for a marketing position at a mid-sized consumer goods company that had offered her a level of professional opportunity nothing in her hometown could match. The decision had been received by her family with a specific, wounded disapproval that never fully dissipated over the following 10 years, treated less as a reasonable career move and more as an abandonment of family obligation, regardless of how frequently Delia tried to demonstrate her continued commitment through other means. She called Aggie every single Sunday evening for 14 years, a ritual so consistent that Aggie had once joked, near the end of her life, that she could set a clock by it. She flew back for every major holiday she could manage, contributed generously to family expenses whenever asked, and had taken 2 weeks of unpaid leave from her job during Aggie's final decline specifically to sit at her grandmother's bedside, holding her hand through the long, difficult nights when hospice care could manage the physical symptoms but couldn't touch the specific loneliness of dying. It was during one of these final visits, in a lucid stretch between longer periods of medicated sleep, that Aggie had gripped Delia's hand with surprising strength and made her promise something that Delia had carried, in the months since, like a stone in her chest. "I don't care what happens to the money," Aggie had said, her voice thin but clear. "But that house needs to stay in this family somehow. Your uncle's going to want to sell it fast, split up the money, move on. Don't let that happen if you can help it. Promise me you'll find a way." Delia had promised, meaning it completely in the moment, though she hadn't yet understood exactly what form keeping that promise might eventually take. Aggie died 6 weeks later, in early spring, and Delia had flown back for the funeral, sat through the wake, hugged relatives she rarely saw, and returned to Ohio afterward under the general, unspoken assumption, never directly stated by anyone, simply implied through the family's established patterns, that the practical matters of the estate would be handled by whoever remained most physically present, which meant primarily Desmond and Carol, with Renata contributing occasional input from the sidelines. What Delia hadn't anticipated, in the months that followed, was just how completely she'd be excluded from even the basic communication about what was happening with the house. She called her mother periodically to ask for updates and received, each time, some version of "we're still figuring things out" or Desmond's handling the paperwork that gave her no actual sense of timeline or process. She assumed, reasonably given the family's usual pace with anything requiring collective decision-making, that the house would sit unsold for the better part of a year while everyone slowly worked through the logistics, and had planned, vaguely, to raise the subject of buying it herself once things reached a more concrete stage, a plan she'd begun quietly preparing for even then, researching mortgage pre-approval options and calculating what she could realistically afford using savings she'd built over a decade of careful, disciplined budgeting. She had no idea, throughout this entire period, that Desmond had already listed the house with a real estate agent within 3 months of Aggie's death, had already fielded multiple offers, had already accepted one from a young couple looking to renovate the property, and had already closed the sale and distributed the proceeds among himself, Renata, Carol, and their fourth sibling, Uncle Femi, who lived out of the country and had apparently participated in the whole process via a handful of brief phone calls. Nobody had thought to include Delia in any stage of this, not the decision to sell, not the listing process, not the offer negotiations, not the closing, not the distribution of proceeds that had apparently split the sale amount 4 ways among Aggie's children while entirely excluding any of the grandchildren from consideration, a detail that Delia would later learn had been framed, among the siblings, as simply the obvious and uncontroversial way to handle things, since the house had technically belonged only to Aggie's direct children rather than any of her grandchildren, regardless of whatever emotional claim Delia might have felt she had. Delia found out about the sale on a Tuesday evening in October, scrolling through her phone after a long day at work, when a real estate listing appeared in her social media feed with the particular, algorithmic cruelty of a platform that had apparently decided, based on her past searches for homes in her hometown, that she'd want to see photographs of a pale blue Victorian on Winslow Street tagged with the word "sold" in bold red letters across the corner of the image. She stared at her phone for a long moment before the recognition fully landed, some part of her brain initially refusing to process what she was looking at, certain there had to be some mistake, some other pale blue Victorian in some other town that merely resembled the house she'd spent every summer of her childhood inside. But the listing photos, once she clicked through them with hands that had started, almost involuntarily, to shake, showed unmistakably familiar details: the wraparound porch where Aggie used to sit shelling peas, the back garden with its stubborn fig tree, the kitchen with the same yellow-tiled Delia remembered from decades of summer mornings, all of it staged now with the sterile, depersonalized furniture of a real estate listing, stripped of every trace of the life that had once filled it. The listing indicated the sale had closed nearly 3 weeks earlier. Delia sat on her couch for a long time after that, phone still in her hand, feeling something cold and disorienting settle into her chest, a specific kind of vertigo that came from discovering a major, irreversible family decision through a social media algorithm rather than a single phone call from anyone who'd actually been involved. She called her mother first, her hand still not quite steady, and Renata answered with the particular, evasive brightness she deployed whenever she suspected an uncomfortable conversation was coming. "Mom," Delia said, skipping past any preamble, "why didn't anyone tell me the house sold?" There was a pause on the line, long enough that Delia understood, before her mother even spoke, that this wasn't going to be framed as an oversight. "Oh, honey, it happened kind of quickly, and honestly, we figured you had enough going on with your own life. We didn't want to bother you with all the logistics." "You didn't want to bother me with the sale of my grandmother's house. It's not like there was anything for you to actually do, Delia. It was Desmond's job as executor, and honestly, once the offer came in, things moved fast, and by the time we'd worked through everything, it just felt like there wasn't really a natural moment to loop you in." Delia felt something tighten in her throat, a familiar, exhausting mixture of hurt and disbelief that she'd experienced countless times before with his family, but that landed, this time, with a weight that felt different, more final. There's always a natural moment to tell someone their grandmother's house is being sold, Mom. You call them. That's the natural moment. Renata didn't have a good answer for that, offering instead a series of deflections about how busy everyone had been, how complicated the estate process was, how she was sure Desmond hadn't meant anything by it, deflections that told Delia, more clearly than any direct explanation could have, exactly how little consideration had gone into whether she deserved to know before the fact rather than after. She called her cousin Yvette next, hoping for a more honest account, and got exactly that, delivered with a particular, guilty discomfort of someone who'd known something uncomfortable and hadn't found the courage to share it. "We didn't think you'd care that much," Yvette admitted, after Delia pressed her. "You moved away years ago. Everyone kind of figured you'd already moved on from all that, emotionally." The comment landed with a specific, cumulative weight, calling up a decade of similar assumptions she'd absorbed from her family. The idea that physical distance necessarily meant emotional distance, that her decade of weekly phone calls and holiday visits and financial contributions somehow counted for less than the family's collective, unexamined narrative about who had really shown up for Aggie and who hadn't. She learned, over the following days of increasingly difficult phone calls, the full shape of what had happened. Desmond had listed the house within 3 months of Aggie's death, moving quickly through the sale process with an efficiency that suggested he'd been eager to finalize things before anyone could raise complications, and had split the proceeds 4 ways among himself, Renata, Carol, and Femi, Aggie's 4 surviving children, while never once considering, apparently, that any of the grandchildren might have a claim, financial or otherwise, worth acknowledging. Delia spent that week in a strange, hollowed-out state, moving through her work obligations with a kind of numb functionality while privately replaying, again and again, the promise she'd made to Aggie in those final weeks. That house needs to stay in this family somehow. Promise me you'll find a way. A promise she'd meant with her whole heart and had now, apparently, failed to keep before she'd even had the chance to try. It was on a Thursday evening, sitting alone in her apartment with a glass of wine she'd barely touched, that something in her shifted from grief into something more active and determined. She pulled up the listing again, found the real estate agent's name attached to the sale, and began, with the same careful, methodical energy she brought to her professional work, researching exactly how the transaction had unfolded, who the buyers were, what price the house had ultimately sold for, whether there was any possibility, however remote, of the new owners being willing to sell again so soon after closing. The answer, as it turned out, was more promising than she'd dared hope. The couple who'd purchased the house, a young pair named the Whitfields, had bought it as a renovation project, intending to flip it for profit within a year rather than live in it themselves. A detail Delia learned from the listing agent, a friendly, talkative woman named Benita Reyes, during a call where Delia, without disclosing her personal connection to the property, simply expressed interest as a prospective buyer looking for renovation opportunities in that specific neighborhood. Delia didn't tell Benita, or anyone else involved in the transaction, who she actually was. She'd thought carefully about this decision over the following days, understanding instinctively that if her family learned what she was attempting before it was finalized, the resulting drama and interference, Desmond's likely outrage at being circumvented, Renata's anxious hand-wringing, the collective, exhausting family process of litigating every detail of a plan that was, ultimately, none of their business anymore, would only complicate what needed to remain a clean, private transaction. She set up a limited liability company, Winslow Property Holdings, with the help of a business attorney she found through a referral from a colleague, structuring the purchase entirely through the LLC so that her name would never appear directly on any public document connected to the sale. The negotiation took 6 weeks. The Whitfields, it turned out, had already begun encountering the kinds of unexpected costs that often accompanied renovation projects on century-old houses, outdated wiring that needed full replacement, foundation issues the initial inspection hadn't fully caught, a leak in the roof that had gone unnoticed until the first significant autumn rain. When Delia's LLC submitted an offer nearly 15% above what they'd originally paid, delivered through Bonita with no indication of any personal history attached to the property, the Whitfields accepted within days, relieved to exit a project that had already begun exceeding their renovation budget and timeline. Delia signed the closing documents in early December, sitting in a lawyer's conference room 4 states away from the house itself, feeling a complicated mixture of grief and vindication as she watched her signature go onto paperwork that would, once processed, make her the legal owner of the home where she'd learned to can tomatoes and read tarot cards and understand, for the first time in her life, what it felt like to be truly listened to by an adult. She'd paid for the purchase using a combination of her savings, a mortgage secured against her own financial profile, and a portion of a bonus she'd received that year from work, money that represented, in its way, a decade of the exact discipline and independence her family had always treated as evidence of insufficient devotion rather than what it actually was. She didn't tell her family immediately. She spent the following months quietly managing the property from a distance, hiring a local contractor to handle the renovation work the Whitfields had already started, making decisions about the house's restoration with the same care Aggie herself might have exercised, choosing paint colors and fixtures that honored the home's original character rather than modernizing it beyond recognition. She flew back twice during this period, staying in a hotel rather than with family, walking through the house alone during the renovation process and feeling, each time, a specific, quiet grief mixed with something steadier and more hopeful, the sense of a promise slowly, carefully being kept, even if nobody who mattered to the promise's original context yet understood what she'd done. It was nearly 8 months after the initial sale, at a family gathering for her cousin's engagement party, that the truth finally surfaced, not through any deliberate reveal on Delia's part, but through a chance comment from Bonita Reyes, who happened to mention the Winslow Street sale to a mutual acquaintance who, through the specific, small-world coincidences that seemed to govern most family secrets, turned out to know Aunt Carol. The information reached Desmond within days, delivered with a kind of scandalized urgency reserved for genuinely surprising family news, and by the time Delia's phone rang that evening with her uncle's name on the screen, she understood, picking up the call, that the quiet phase of her plan had finally come to its natural end.